Getting here was a nightmare. The roads were a sea of red lights. In this statement, the speaker is using a figure of speech to create a picture of a very busy street where the traffic is almost at a standstill. A sea of red lights portray the image of the brake lights of scores of vehicles on a busy street. Hello, I'm Paula. Welcome to my channel where I bring you insightful English grammar lessons to improve your knowledge of English. But before I go any further, may I ask you to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of my lessons. What is a figure of speech? A figure of speech is exactly that, a figure of speech or writing. It is a word or phrase used to make the speech or writing more forceful or persuasive. It creates a visual image of a point that is expressed. There are many figures of speech in English, and we use them daily, both consciously and unconsciously. When we use words as they would be defined in a dictionary, we call that literal language. They are straightforward writing. For example, if you wish to say that a man's table manners is very poor and that his eating behavior is very upsetting to those around him, you may say, the man eats very greedily. This would be expressing how the man eats in a literal way. We know that greedily means he may be eating as if he has not eaten in many days. But if we wish to be more forceful and more clearly with our description, we use words that will form a picture of something similar to what we want to describe and to enhance what we want to say. We call that figurative language. Figurative language uses what we call figures of speech, which is what we will be talking about in this lesson. This language is used a lot in plays, novels, and poems. So, instead of saying, the man eats very greedily, which is using literal language, we may say, the man eats like a pig. This is using figurative language. Eats like a pig is a figure of speech used, and this figure of speech is called a simile. This gives a more vivid picture of how the man eats. We know that a pig eats sloppily and messily. So now we have a picture of the man being very messy and maybe stuffing the food into his mouth and spilling it all over the place. This description helps to make the point of how the man eats more forcefully or more clearly. You're able to form a more vivid picture in your mind of how the man eats. In this lesson, which will be done in 3 parts, I will introduce you to 18 of the most commonly used figures of speech with examples in sentences. They are in groups as follows. Simile and metaphor are figures of speech of comparison. Antithesis, oxymoron, and paradox are figures of speech of contrast and contradiction. Hyperbole, litotes, and understatement are figures of speech of exaggeration. Alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia are figures of speech that are sound related. Pun and irony are figures of speech that play on words. Metonymy, synecdoche, and euphemism are figures of speech of substitutions. Then we have personification that portrays human-like qualities, and apostrophe that addresses absent or imaginary entities. Today's video, which will be part 1 of this 3-part lesson, I will introduce you to these 5 figures of speech. They are in the groups comparisons and contrast and contradictions. You may know these figures of speech because you use them every day, but you may not know what they are called. It is important, especially for students sitting exams, to know the names of the figures of speech. Our first figure of speech, and the most popular one, is a simile. A simile compares two different things using as or like. Examples are: without her glasses, Mary is as blind as a bat. As blind as a bat is a figure of speech. This sentence uses a simile to compare Mary's vision without her glasses to the vision of a bat, which is commonly perceived as poor. The phrase, as blind as a bat, emphasizes how significantly impaired Mary's ability to see is without her glasses. Our next example is: despite the warm weather, his hands felt as cold as ice. As cold as ice is the figure of speech. This sentence uses a simile to compare the temperature of his hands to ice, despite the surrounding warm weather. The phrase, as cold as ice, highlights the extreme coldness of his hands, creating a vivid contrast to the warm environment. And our last example is: after winning the competition, Tom walked around as proud as a peacock. The figure of speech in this sentence is as proud as a peacock. As peacocks are known for their proud behavior, it conveys Tom's feeling of pride and self-satisfaction. Our next figure of speech is the metaphor. The metaphor makes a direct comparison by substituting the compared thing for the real thing being compared. It's saying one is the other. Unlike similes, it does not use like or as. For example, my mom has a heart of gold. The figure of speech is a heart of gold. I'm likening my mom's heart to gold, which is precious and valuable. If I had said, my mom's heart is like gold, that figure of speech would be a simile. So the metaphor is saying my mom's heart is gold, and the simile says her heart is like gold. Our next example is: time is a thief that steals moments from our lives. The figure of speech is time is a thief. This metaphor is comparing time to a thief by suggesting that it takes away moments from our lives, just like a thief that steals our possessions. It conveys the idea that time passes quickly and often takes away opportunities and experiences before we realize it. And our last example in this set is: the world is a stage and we are merely players. The figure of speech is the world is a stage. You know that on a stage we have actors playing different roles. The metaphor is saying that people's actions and behavior are like performances on a stage, which is the world. It's comparing the world to a stage. Our next set are figures of speech of contrast and contradictions. Our first figure of speech in this group is antithesis. Antithesis places opposite things or ideas next to one another in order to draw out their contrast. For example, in life, it is important to hope for the best, prepare for the worst. The figure of speech is hope for the best, prepare for the worst. This sentence uses antithesis by placing the contrasting ideas of hoping for a positive outcome, but at the same time preparing for a negative one. So there we see the contrast of opposite ideas. Our next example is: in a negotiation, it's wise to keep your mouth closed and your eyes open. The figure of speech is keep your mouth closed and your eyes open. Again, this is placing opposite ideas next to one another. It's contrasting the actions of keeping one's mouth closed, which means to remain silent, and keeping one's eyes open, which means to be observant. And our last example is, during the turbulent times of the revolution, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. This is juxtaposing the extreme opposites of the best and the worst of times to emphasize the contradictions and complexities of the era. Our next figure of speech in this group is the oxymoron. The oxymoron uses contradicting words or phrases with opposing meanings to create a new meaning. For example, the couple had bittersweet memories of their time together. The figure of speech is bittersweet. Bittersweet combines two contradicting words, bitter and sweet. It highlights the mixed emotions the couple feels about their memories, suggesting that their relationship was both happy and sad. Our next example is, the clown's performance was seriously funny. The figure of speech is seriously funny. Seriously and funny are contradicting words. It emphasizes the extreme humor of the clown's performance by contrasting it with its opposite meaning. And our last example in this set is, as the spectators awaited the verdict, the silence was deafening inside the courtroom. The figure of speech is, the silence was deafening. Silence is the absence of sound, while deafening means extremely loud noise. This emphasizes the intensity of the silence in the courtroom, suggesting that it was so profound and overwhelming that it felt almost as impactful as a loud noise. And our last figure of speech in this group is paradox. A paradox is a statement that appears to contradict itself but reveals some truth. For example, less is more when it comes to designing a small cottage. The figure of speech is less is more. It appears to be self-contradictory because how can less be more? But it reveals the truth as it pertains to designing a small cottage, that being simple and minimalist can lead to a greater aesthetic appeal. Our next example is, to bring peace, we must prepare for war. This sentence again is contradictory. You may ask, how can war bring peace? But the idea is that by preparing for conflict may bring some form of stability by determining aggressors, thereby bringing peace. And our last example, the beginning of the end started with that crucial decision. The figure of speech is the beginning of the end. The phrase appears contradictory because beginnings and endings are opposites, but it conveys the idea that a specific decision marked the start of a process that would lead to a specific conclusion. I will end part 1 of this lesson here. In part 2, I will give you the next 2 sets of figures of speech. Those are figures of speech of exaggeration and sound related. Please look out for part 2 of this lesson, which will follow this video. I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.